Hello and welcome. I'm Monica Warline, Faculty Director at the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan Stephen M. Ross School of Business. And I'm so delighted that you've joined us for today's Positive Links Speaker Series session entitled, Where Does DEI Go From Here? A few notes on the technology that we will use today. We really invite you to turn off your other technology, close out your other tabs, and relax into this event. We have turned off the raise hand, chat, and Q&A features so you can sit back and enjoy a fascinating conversation with Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts. We have enabled live transcription services for the event. You can activate that feature if you want to use it on your Zoom settings at the bottom of your screen. And we are recording this session and we'll share it in the coming days. I would like to thank our sponsors for the Positive Links Speaker Series, Sanger Leadership Center, Taubert Institute for Global Operations, and the Samuel Zell and Robert H. Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies. We are so grateful for their sponsorship support of our speaker series this year, and we have promotional partners who help us get the word out. We'd like to thank Ann Arbor Spark and the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management. If you would like to be a promotional partner, please get in touch with us. We are delighted to have the chance to share positive links with you, to bring you leading scholars who offer inspiring and practical science-informed strategies to help you and your organization thrive. We want to keep this series growing and freely open and available to everyone. If you are a friend of our work and could support us at any amount, it would be joyfully and gratefully received. Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts was named one of the Thinkers 50, a definitive list of the most influential management thinkers in the world. And the awards committee wrote of her, creating fairer career opportunities is an urgent necessity. Laura Morgan Roberts is leading the way in making this a reality. Now, Dr. Roberts is one of the voices we turn to whenever we want to understand questions about maximizing human potential in diverse organizations and communities. She is co-editor of a definitive book in this space entitled Race, Work, and Leadership. And she's author of a Harvard Business Review article that's one of the top 12 in the 100-year history of the Harvard Business Review, entitled Toward a Racially Just Workplace. She is the Frank M. Sands Senior Associate Professor of Business at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. And of course, we're very proud that she's an affiliate faculty member of the Center for Positive Organizations and a Michigan graduate, having done her PhD in organizational psychology at the University of Michigan. So we really hope that today's visit to Positive Links, Laura, feels like a form of coming home. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you to talk with us about your new big ideas piece on this provocative question, where does DEI go from here?
Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you, CPO. And yes, I always feel at home with the University of Michigan and with my CPO community.
Can we start off our conversation about this question that you've asked in this article by just setting the stage about why the question matters so much right now? And I know you point out that there's a lot of headwinds for work on justice, diversity, inclusion. And I think maybe just speaking to why the question feels so urgent.
I think the best way for us to enter into the conversation, as the title of the article sort of alludes, where does DEI go from here, is to also think about how we got where we are currently, and use that information to help carve a path forward. There's also the implication in the title that maybe we don't want to keep going in the same directions that we've traveled previously. Do we have some options? Do we have some choices? Are there new possibilities for the future of how we work together, how we live together, how the field continues to take up this work that we haven't yet explored? So, love to talk about both of those. Let me start with a little bit of context. And in so doing, I'm going to kind of teleport myself back to the times when we were at Michigan together in our doctoral studies program. So, what were the conversations in the 90s and how have they shaped where we are today? I won't give you the long version, I promise. We have lots of things to talk about today. But short version as it relates to these questions of freedom at work, because that's the framework that I'm
Mhm.
presenting in response to the question, where does DEI go from here? Focusing more on freedom at work. So the irony is, in the 90s, I think our conversations were focused a lot around job security and the lack thereof. So it wasn't about how I can feel more free at work, is how can I feel more secure at work, more cared for at work, having more trust with new forms of expansion and growth that really destabilize these long-standing conventional employment relationships. Our psychological contract was changing, in other words. Layoffs were more rampant, mergers and acquisitions, global expansion. And people were asking, where do I find myself in this new organizational world, in this new organizational form? So, eh, it's almost like they were seeking a little bit more security, or at least that's the way that we in the field presented their
Mhm.
desires and experiences in the workplace. And then that moved us into the early 2000s. And this is when I started my faculty career, and really started exploring more about workforce experiences, DE&I, organizational psychology. And at that point, there was more of a zest and an intrigue and
Mhm.
excitement around entrepreneurship, striking it out on my own and leaving the institution behind, finding a space where I could go, all in and see what I could build and create independently. So a different freedom conversation, right?
Mhm.
Economic pressures, tides, changes have, shifted us away from that extreme entrepreneurship in the odds. But still, some of those principles we've carried forward. People don't want to check their identities at the door when they come into the workplace. They don't want to sacrifice meaning, significance, and purpose for a paycheck. They're not counting on a long-term employment relationship and a solid, hefty pension package at the end of that career in one individual organization or with one employer, right? Um, and so they're carrying now these demands back into the workplace, and their expectations are that work will be meaningful, work will be fulfilling, work will be nourishing and gratifying, that workplaces will provide the opportunities for us to thrive and flourish.
Mhm.
And so this is where I'm coming in to the conversation intellectually around, how do we thrive and flourish in the current world of work, given the opportunities, demands, and the zeitgeist around our human experience. But if that would be the intellectual or academic side, I'm an organizational theorist, right? I'm also a person who has lived through the past
Mhm.
3 to 5 years.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's a whole different version of the story of why
Yeah.
this conversation is so urgent and how we got to be, where we are. So in 2020, we were confronted with a global pandemic. And at the same time, we were also confronted with racial injustice and a number of other health and wealth inequalities that, you know, heightened the impact of the pandemic on many communities. We started to think about who had more support, more resources, um, to be able to live comfortably, freely, and flourish in the context of work and in their communities. We had widespread racial protests and demonstrations, or anti-racist demonstrations, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and many other highly visible murders of citizens who happen to be Black or brown by authority figures in many circumstances, but oftentimes by deputized citizens. And at that very moment, people are also feeling confined and constrained and less free to move about. We're literally masking to save our lives and save others' lives. And so questions of freedom were top of mind, many layers for me, as we started to have conversations with leaders in 2020, 2021, who said, look, I really want to advance our organization and advance our society in these diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. And I want to understand what the data say. What does the research tell us about what people actually want or need? Why are people so frustrated right now? Why are people so discouraged right now? Why are people feeling so disheartened and marginalized in the context of their work? And what kinds of tips and tools and tactics can you offer that can help me as a leader, as an executive, as a manager, to create a work environment where people can thrive and flourish? And at that moment, Monica, I really had to, just take stock of everything that I had read and studied and what had inspired me and the data that we had collected, my work in over 20 years of collaborations, and find a way to synthesize all of that and communicate the key issues and a way forward, often in 10 to 15 minutes or less. So,
Yeah.
so that was a short window. So that was probably more the
Yeah.
practical impetus for thinking about freedom at work and bringing this framework.
Yeah.
But the question, where does DEI go from here? Sure, it in part was my question, but in large part, those were questions that people all around the world were asking,
Yeah.
because they experienced it to be a critical juncture, I would say. And so in the years that have followed, that peak moment of interest and curiosity and dialogue, visibility around these conversations, we've seen a lot of organizations make promises and commitments and pledges.
Mhm.
Um, let's say even those with the best intentions are realizing that it's a tall order and we have to play the long game, and it's easier said than done to
Yeah.
support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm hoping that through these conversations around freedom at work, that we can help support those who are already committed and already invested and are looking for more tools and resources. And for those who aren't, and I talk about that, you just mentioned that, the headwinds, right? Those who
Yeah.
really feel like all of the DEI conversation got way too much attention and way too many resources over the past few years. And so they're trying to redirect those resources to,
Right.
take away that or even censor those conversations, to limit the freedom to learn, to discuss, to explore around these issues. Interestingly, many of them are also using a freedom narrative,
Yeah.
a freedom
Yeah.
framework that we can explore to sort of justify why they shouldn't have to do this work and why they shouldn't have to support others doing this work. So, perhaps if we have more of the conversation using similar language and frameworks and drawing upon data, that we might be able to move forward in more productive, regenerative ways. The last thing I will say is the link to CPO. to the Center for Positive Organizations, because that's another important piece of the puzzle in
Mm.
asking this question. Um, Given the fact that there are a number of challenges and these challenges extend back centuries,
Mhm.
given the fact that, freedom is not a new conversation on the table, certainly not one that I have initiated. This is something that has shaped forms of government and radical revolutions around the world for, centuries to come, and centuries past, and will continue in years to come. So the freedom at work is a broad existential question. It also is an aspirational question.
Yes.
That's what we do in the Center for Positive Organizations. We think about our highest virtues individually and collectively.
Yeah.
And we try to look for pockets of goodness and inspiration and understand processes of strengthening and growing. And so here, I'm interested in the next phase of this work, unlocking even more insight about these emancipatory processes. I know it sounds like a paradox to talk about freedom at work. I know it may even sound like an oxymoron to some, like, well, why would you even expect that? Why would you look that? That's not what work is designed for. But we could probably say that about many of the different topics that we have explored through our lens of positive organizing. And we've been able to carve out new paths by taking that approach.
Laura, I think it's obvious in a way once you name it that this framework that you've developed was forged in a crucible, because it's immensely powerful and rich and dense. And the work that you've done to, as you said, respond to this call that the world was issuing to you to somehow synthesize over your whole life experience and everything that you had studied and say it in 15 minutes. It just it resulted in no small thing that you are calling us to, which I think is perfect for what we want to hold at the Center for Positive Organizations for ourselves and for the organizations of the world. And I just wanted to quote you to yourself, if you don't mind, along these lines, and ask you to say whatever comes to mind, right? Knowing that in part, you're speaking to a community that loves you and that loves your work, and that you're issuing us this really big call. So you wrote that my research in the fields of positive psychology and diversity and inclusion leads me to believe that to truly engage each and every employee and to help them feel validated and rewarded, organizations need to cultivate 4 freedoms that allow people to bring their full humanity to work. Now, that's speaking through a question, where does DEI go to here, to this huge call to create organizations that engage every person to feel truly validated, rewarded, and fully human.
Let's say until we commit to that shared aspiration, we will continue to design, implement, and be confined by suboptimal processes and practices and toxic exploitative cultures. So the bottom line is that our world currently is already diverse
Yes.
by fact. Okay, this is not something that we have to go out and seek on a global level. It is the essence of who we are. So the question becomes, how do we coexist on this planet in a way that allows for all of us and the planet itself to thrive and flourish? So it's a tall order because it's a grave situation when we start to think about, even just through the lens of freedom, if my personal freedom is inextricably bound with your oppression and your exploitation, then as a planet, we're going to continue to deplete. We will continue to compete, and violent conflict will also continue to erupt
Yeah.
in those ways of thinking and living. So when I'm speaking of all and true humanity,
Mhm.
I'm thinking of something again that is, I know, so ambitious,
Yeah.
so aspirational, a tall order, but also I think the only option
Yeah.
for us
But
to be able to move forward together,
yes.
is we have to see these emancipatory practices as ones that promote collective flourishing, not a zero sum, I win, you lose, I'm freer because you are more confined and more bound. So that's where it gets philosophical.
Right.
And so I know we'll get more
Yeah.
practical around what that looks like
Yes.
and how to execute
Yes.
it. But
Yes.
that's the spirit behind
That's the
that
spirit.
particular aspect of the article and setting up the framework. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you're calling for, in many ways, uh, um, re-looking right at most of what we think of about work environments. And like I listened to you in conversation with Kurt Nickish on the Idea Cast, the HBR podcast, and you said something so profound when you were talking to him. He was asking you, like, what do you mean by this word freedom? And you said, we're always learning, we're always adjusting, we're always dismantling parts of the system that are constraining, confining, or oppressive. And we're rebuilding in ways that allow us to co-create more value. And I feel like that is an amazing view of how organizing and freedom meet. Like, you're calling us to rebuild organizations completely. And I love this. I love that you're calling us to this big of a question.
I mean, it is definitely one of those questions that brings out, I think, the ever enduring tension between sort of the business imperative and a moral claim. And so I try to be transparent about that because, I recognize that the current organizational form and the limitations that we have on many of these four freedoms is quite profitable, and that's why it has endured. It was designed to meet the needs of the key, most powerful stakeholders, and thus it continues to produce the results that it was designed to produce and to generate. So to reimagine a new organizational form would require those who benefit the most from the current form, which is rife with inequality, um, and affords a tremendous amount of freedom to some individuals in the organization, just not to everybody.
Yeah.
So that's the point. It's not that freedom is not existing and that people who don't have these four freedoms, the freedom to be, the freedom to become, the freedom to fade, the freedom to fail. Many people absolutely do, but those tend to be those who are the most powerful and privileged members of the organizations. And so they continue to exercise those freedoms quite fully, but others throughout the organization don't have the same access to those freedoms. And so, some people say, well, how do you persuade somebody who is benefiting from a system to fundamentally redesign that system so that it operates in a way that is more virtuous, not from a personal standpoint, my own belief about myself or my identity, but from being a generative co-creation zone of co-creation where we are helping to sustain one another and helping to sustain our planet. Um, I don't know if there's a check, a dollar sign, or any form of currency or transaction that would be large enough that could outsize the impact of extreme wealth inequality. For those who are most powerful and most privileged. So they still, though, endorse these four. Some still endorse these four freedoms.
Yes.
And so why? The question is why? What is it tapping into? Certainly they see some instrumental benefit, they see some tangible benefit, they see some outcomes, for their business, or for their organization or for their community. But I would say they also care.
Mm-hmm.
It aligns in some way to a core value they hold around humanity and around flourishing, and they want to have a positive impact and they want to be a part of that. And
Yeah.
so we'll make some choices and decisions about how we organize and lead and structure our work in ways that can promote more of the thriving and flourishing at work.
So let's turn the corner a little bit. And you named the four freedoms, but we want to go through one at a time and have our audience have a chance to learn more about what you mean by these. So the first you call the freedom to be. What do you mean by that in a contemporary workplace?
So for each of the freedoms, I'm going to highlight a myth, and then I'll explain a little bit more about what I
Okay.
mean, which may fly in the face of the myth. And that's sort of how our conversation has been unfolding so far, is thinking, well, one would assume X. So if we put a different framework on it, what might that lead us to consider or to ask? So the freedom to be. This is actually where I started my research. Always been fascinated about questions around authenticity. And so the freedom to be. The myth here is just be yourself. What's so hard about that? Why do you need somebody else's permission to be yourself? Well, it's a free country, that we say in the United States of America. We like to use that phrase very often to refer to the different kinds of social or constitutional freedoms that we have. We have freedom of speech, we have freedom of expression. You can pick what job or career you want, and then you need to show up and dress the part. Those are all personal, individual choices. So freedom to be, just be yourself. What's the big deal, Laura? Why do we need a whole segment of a framework around that? So reality, research shows, and I'm sure lived experience even more than any data that I could provide you individually or through our analysis of research that we published in Academy of Management Annals with my colleagues. It's not as easy to express our authentic selves at work as we might like. Authenticity involves a series of calibrated expressions, strategic disclosures, filters, for some facades. We are masking different parts of ourselves that we think are not valued by the work environment, because we're different, because we don't fit into the norm or the prototype. And the travesty there is when we're suppressing and hiding our differences at work, we're not able to draw upon some of the most powerful strengths and resources that we can bring in our work experiences. When we're feeling more authentic, we have a deeper sense of coherence and integrity, so that facilitates more well-being, organizationally and institutionally. If we're sharing our diverse opinions and perspectives and expressing those sincerely and authentically, the organization benefits from our ideas, our perspectives, our social capital, our cultural capital. So there are some tangible benefits as well, but bottom line, it's not as simple as just being yourself. So the first freedom to be, talks about how we can create work environments that help to engage more of people's authentic valued selves. And it also highlights the point that when you deviate or depart from the norm or the prototype in any way, in style, appearance, background, or in your thinking, that it becomes more and more challenging for you to tap into this level of freedom at work. And so, organizations, leaders, managers want to be mindful of the experiences that people are having around authenticity in the workplace.
So here again, I feel like as organizational scholars, you're pointing to this like fundamental tension that organizations exist to create conformity in some ways, and that we have this kind of human quest that you're naming at the heart of humanity for the freedom from that conformity. And those are sort of coexisting and co-creating each other all the time. So I wonder what the smartest people that you're with who are paying a lot of attention to this in their organizations are doing. Like, what's the cutting edge of creating more freedom to be in work organizations?
So I think in the freedom to be comes a focus on creating a sense of community and belonging. And that's what I would say the smartest people are doing. And it's the community and belonging that sort of welcomes diverse perspectives and backgrounds, allows for subgroups and subcultures to form around different areas of connection. Um, doesn't require extreme assimilation to feel a part of the community or belonging, is what I'm saying. But helps us to recognize the wide range of diverse identities that are present within any organization, and to then think about how we can connect with others around those identities at work, and how we can also draw upon all of the different insight and wisdom that those identities provide us in the organization. The last thing that I would highlight on this, for the leader, the most successful senior executives who have kind of gone against the grain, they don't fit the mold, they don't fit the prototype, they have learned how to be positive deviants. So they have learned how to stand out and leverage their distinctiveness in a way that helps to set them apart. They use their authenticity as a form of their competitive advantage, and they do it with intention, strategy, and of course with some discretion. So it's not what comes up comes out, but it, how do I channel my
Yeah,
signature self
yeah.
and sort of build, continue to bring that in the organization in ways that help me to have deeper, more genuine and meaningful connections with others.
Yeah. Well, and that really dovetails with the next freedom that you name, which you call the freedom to become our best selves, right? And this one's near and dear to our hearts, right? Which is that you created this beautiful exercise, the reflected best self exercise, which the Center for Positive Organization still uses often. And it seems like something at work, again, I'm sure you have a myth, right? That what would stop us from being our best selves at work? Why is that hard?
Why is that hard? Well, the couple things. One, highlight co-created, didn't individually create, but this was my first deep entree into the Center for Positive Organizations. Our work on best self and using the reflected best self exercise was my way of sort of learning what is possible when you take an intense and often exclusive focus on what's working well at the individual level, focusing on people's strengths and contributions and using them as a platform for growth and development. So the myth is, in order to, well, there are two myths, let me say. First, and freedom to become, the first myth is to become, I have to be the best. Right.
Mm,
So it's a competitive dynamic. Becoming
mm,
is I'm going to train, train, train. until, work to the bone until I can be the best. And so our radical pivot on that is that it's not about being the best when flourishing is our desired end. If winning under certain terms and circumstances is the desired end, then yeah, perhaps that's the strategy. But if we're going for flourishing, it's not about being the best, it's about being our personal best and self-actualizing into our personal best, which then brings up the second part of this myth. In order to become my personal best, I have to fix all the things that are wrong with me. And what we're highlighting in the second freedom is, in part, it's freeing our minds from that deficit focus, that being obsessed with all of the things about us that are less than, that don't seem to measure up, that we need to work on, that our shortcomings and our weaknesses, they can become so consuming because our brains are hardwired to focus on those. So they can become so consuming that we stop thinking about our strengths and things that have gone well and how we can continue to grow and develop in those areas of strength. So freedom number 2, the freedom to become, is asking the question of all of us: how can we become our best selves by growing and developing in our areas of strength and learning more through community about how we make positive, sustained contributions to the community, right? So it's not just doing something really well that I love doing really well and being a master at doing it. As you know, Monica, when we talk about reflected best self, we're also talking about how are we strengthening other people and how are we strengthening other other institutions. So yes, my strengths, yes, my vitality, my flourishing, but also impact on others. That is as important for freedom to become as as any of the other outcomes that we might highlight around growth and development. It's an impact question.
Yeah. Yes. And I've heard you say, and you write in the article also, that we exist in a praise deficit, right? Workplace tends to point us toward what we're not doing well and really focus us there. Um, but so I know, knowing that these forms of strength-based development are so central to how you work in the world and how you share your messages with the world and how you teach and approach and facilitate these questions. What are some ways that you advise organizations to engage with creating this freedom and distributing this freedom more equitably?
Yeah, we have to normalize conversations around strengths. We have to normalize highlighting what's working well and learning from those experiences. And by normalize, I mean, make it a ritual, make it a practice, equally distribute this focus and emphasis on strengths throughout the organization, because not everybody lives in a praise deficit. When I say we live in a praise deficit, I'm talking about, the 99% of us. But there are some who, because of their access to power and resources and stature, we know we don't tend to share bad news with the most powerful people in our organizations. So they don't often get the real truth because they're getting a lot of inflated, inflated validation and so forth. So they have a different kind of praise deficit, and theirs is that they don't know what they're really good at either, and they don't know what the organization is really good at either, but that's because everybody's just telling them what they think they want to hear.
Right.
That's a problem too.
Right.
But how do you solve for that? Throughout the organization, we want to have more data-driven, focused conversations about our strengths. We want to also recognize that there are certain patterns that individuals who are considered to be high potential up and comers, they start to benefit from that label and a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And so people start to interpret things that they do more favorably, and they get more praise on an ongoing basis. And it's very subtle. it doesn't have to always be a, big, magnificent presentation with a huge prize. A lot of leaders worry if we talk too much about strengths, everybody's going to expect a bonus and we can't afford that. And so you're telling me you can't afford to pay people what you think they deserve? In some cases, they'll say, yeah, I can. I have some constraints. I'm like, well, then you better at least say thank you.
Yeah.
That's the only thing you have to give him is a compliment. At least pay him a compliment if you can't pay. But anyway, that's a sidebar that we get on. But just remembering that there are certain people who are getting more of the validation that they need so that they can benchmark their own best practices and shape their trajectory in a way that allows them to maximize their contributions. And there are a lot of other people in the organization because of gender, because of race, because of other dimensions of inequality and social categorization. They're kind of floundering around, trying to figure out what it is they're really good at. People also aren't really telling them what they're not so good at. And so they're trying to grow and develop themselves independent of that. Mentorship and sponsorship is especially important here.
Yeah. So let's talk about the freedom to fade. There's a lot packed in this one. Where do you want to start with the freedom to fade?
I'll start by saying that since this article was published in Harvard Business Review in September of 2023, the freedom to fade is the one that I have gotten the most feedback on, where people are saying, yes, that's where I am right now. That's a huge problem for me personally. It's also one that managers are puzzling around the most because they're saying, look, I've got this workforce now, and they say they want more boundaries. They say that they are getting burnt out and they're overworked and they want more flexibility and they want to be able to, set the terms of their employment and, pull back here and lean in there. And how am I supposed to manage that? Because like you said, organizations are not designed for that level of customization and that level of flux. In terms of people's energy levels. Organizations in their current forms were sort of designed with more of a machine mentality, which is that I set the structure, I set the goals, and you, machine/human, you will show up and you will find it within you to deliver according to those standards and expectations every time. And for some members, for those who are marginalized or systemically excluded, they feel in this third freedom that they have to be twice as good to get half as far. So I can't just deliver the standard. I have to go, 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 go all the time and, deliver up to this standard beyond whatever the bar or the level is that many of my peers who would belong to the dominant group or the more represented empowered group might have. So that's why there's so much in the freedom to fade. There's the collective human experience that says, yes, we need this. And now more than ever, given what we've been through as a society, given what organizations expect from us, everybody says, I need a breather. On the complexity on the organizational level, the managerial level, organizations aren't set up to provide these in obvious ways. And so it's creating a puzzle and some disconnects between managers and members of their teams or among team members as they're all trying to move forward and tap into this freedom in ways that won't undermine the whole team. And then the third component is that you have some folks in the organization who, by power and privilege, are able to ease back and fade a little bit more, whereas others, because of the performance pressure, because of stereotyping, because they're one of the first or few, they feel like they really can't afford to fade. And so it becomes a vicious cycle within this third. So the myth is, I can't afford to fade. I can't take time off. I can't pause because if I do fade, then I'll fail.
Right.
And then that goes into the fourth freedom, which is, and there's no room for failure. The fourth freedom is the freedom to fail. There's no room for failure. So the
Right.
third and the fourth are very much tied together.
So within the freedom to fade, you have, I mean, you're once again, you're calling us to sort of go look back at the roots of scientific management and ask some really hard questions, right? And also, so like the shape of what work is comes into question. It just inherently in its nature. Does it mean showing up at a particular place at a particular time? Does it mean exerting a particular level of effort, and so on? And then in addition, in the freedom to fade, you have named this way in which if you're the only of something, right, you're doubly can't fade. Because work itself makes it often impossible to fade in a certain kind of way. Like you're exhausted and you only get paid if you show up anyway. But then if you feel like you're carrying a representation that's a lot broader than yourself, fading has sort of double consequences there. And when you help organizations try to tackle the onlyness, I mean, building the diversity across the organization is a root way to address that. But on the way there, do you have other ways that we could attend to or remedy this, the lack of the freedom to fade for all these people who are sort of the only of whatever in the room?
Yeah, well, I think one place to start is to try to more evenly distribute that freedom throughout the organization, and considering what some who are more privileged within the organization already have and others do not. So when we normalize some of these practices, then the use can be more equitable. So one example could be, maternity leave and paternity leave. So once people recognized that maternity leave was about more than physical recovery from the act of childbirth, but about creating space for someone to bring a tiny human into the world, and for them to reestablish and redefine their own role as a person, as a caregiver, and as a worker in the context of this major life change, then all of a sudden that created more access to essential leave for lots more people. If you're an adoptive parent, if you're a foster parent, if you are a man who did not experience the physical act of childbirth, but are a involved caregiver in your household. So that's an example that doesn't start with, the group that is typically seen as most marginalized. In that case, you might say men and paternity leave. Well, that's not why we often think about, gender and stigmas and impact. But I think it's important to recognize that when we really start to make structural changes in policies, in procedures that allow for the whole self to thrive and flourish, whatever that looks like, yes, it's going to benefit the marginalized group. Yes, it benefits women who take maternity leave to be in organizations where men also take paternity leave, because now there's not the same degree of stigma and stereotyping about taking a pause when you've introduced a new human in your life. It also helps to normalize those who need to provide caregiving for their parents or for other members of their family as they are moving in or moving through some of some of their health challenges, or maybe even their end of life challenges. So again, when we start to normalize these practices, routinize them, and create new policies and procedures, more people across the board tend to benefit from them, not less. We always think of it as special accommodations, special consideration, and then people who take advantage of those or utilize those because they've gotten to the point where they feel they have absolutely no choice, they're stigmatized and penalized for doing that. I would like to see us approach it differently. My last piece on this would be, if you don't plan for it, if you don't set up and design the time within your work schedule, within your workflow, for people to have some of this freedom and bandwidth where we are today in 2023, we don't live in a 9 to 5 society as we did during the age of scientific management. We've got technology. We're expecting people to do, a lot of knowledge work, which is 24/7, whether you're looking at your phone or not, you're taking it with you in your brain. It's a different kind of work, right? So if we don't plan for these breaks, if we don't plan for pauses, if we don't give people some slack time for deep thinking, some slack time for building those meaningful, authentic connections, some slack time for investing in their growth and development, whatever that might look like, the other two freedoms, then they are inevitably going to get to the fourth, which is the failing. But it's not going to be productive failure. It's not going to be that what I'm talking about in the freedom to fail, which is you take smart risks, you learn from them, you have experiments, you have people to help to coach and develop you individually and as a group so that
Yeah.
you feel smart. No, then you just fail hard. And so the individual and the organization don't end up winning. I think my myth is, if I fade, I'm going to fail. The reality is, if you don't fade, you will fail, and you're going to
Yes.
fail in all the wrong ways.
Yes. Yes. I really appreciate, Laura, how you've named in so many different ways through this work that the um, unequal distribution of freedoms is something that leaders and managers and people who care about flourishing at work and people who care about more inclusion, more welcoming, more justice in the organization can be paying attention to, and that it can manifest in many, many, many different kinds of ways. So naming the unequal kind of distribution of these freedoms is it's such an emancipatory way to think about this question. I just am so appreciative of how you have given us a new way of grabbing on to to asking, like a question many of us have been asking for a long time, but really asking it in a new and different way. And one of the unequally distributed freedoms that goes along with freedom to fail is being generously interpreted. And when I talk about compassion at work, I talk about generous interpretations as a core to enacting compassion. Because if we understand the other person is doing their best or trying, or that they're suffering in their life, and we understand generously what's going on at the human level, then we figure out the work stuff. But you're naming that those generous interpretations are so unequally distributed, right? Like gets in the way, right? Obviously, of compassion at work, but gets in the way of growth and learning and this freedom to fail. So I wondered if you would talk about that a little bit.
Oh, I love how you framed it in terms of generous interpretations. So I'll only build on that just a bit here for the sake of time, because there's so much. So I said, from an academic standpoint, I started out with the freedom to be. Like, that was my first core research, that was my dissertation research, that was my, but also the freedom to fail, I think really came to a head in the past few years. A lot of those town halls and a lot of the heart to heart conversations and the disclosures where people were sharing, and they were, in that moment, I think maybe trying to practice more compassion. Well, what you're hearing from members of marginalized groups like Black people in the US, Black people in the UK, members of many other marginalized groups. I can never get away with that. I can
Mm-hmm.
never get away with that. So that's the stiff, strong penalty. What's on the other side of a generous interpretation? It's a less generous interpretation, yes, but there's also a very harsh and stiff consequence for that. So keep in mind with the George Floyd protests in 2020, the protests were about the lack of accountability for the police officer who had committed that offense. And so the narrative around, I can never get away with that. We could never get away with that. Why are people not, that's where the justice and the injustice really, hits a sharp peak. So unfortunately, there's data in the workplace that supports that for instance, in experimental research, you send out a legal memo, and on one of the legal memos, you say that the author of the memo is Black. The other version, you say the author of the legal memo is white. You send it to attorneys, ask them to evaluate it, point out the number of errors. They point out statistically more errors in the Black person's legal memo than they do in the white person's memo, and it's the exact same memo.
Yeah.
So you can imagine how that then plays out. Textio has data on performance evaluations and differences. These are these are consequential. These are consequential. When we don't make the generous interpretation and we come to a very harsh evaluation, it's consequential. For George Floyd, unfortunately, and for many others, unfortunately, it was life ending.
Yeah.
For many of the people on this call, it's career ending. We're still here, but when we're in a vacuum, that we don't have access to the same freedom to fail, that that can feel more confining than anything. So I would say, Monica, when I presented the framework, members of more dominant group, those who typically think of themselves as insiders, they're kind of like stuck on the freedom to fade. Like, oh, wait, no, I can't pull back. I can't fade. What do you mean? Because they don't realize how the power and privilege has been unevenly distributed as it is, and the extent to which you do get to fade a little bit when you don't stand out, right? So that's a big aha for them. And they push back some. The members of the marginalized groups, for instance, Black professionals, when we're presenting the freedom framework, they have this hardest time with the last one because our myth is, I can't afford to fail. And I can't tell you that's not true. According to the data, there are harsh and severe consequences. But I also know that if we're afraid of failure, we'll never be able to flourish. So it's a risk that we have to learn how to take. We have to learn how to take it with courage and with some insight and strategy around that.
Laura, I can't thank you enough for joining us for this conversation today. And all I can say is that I'm leaving hungry for more and hopeful that we can bring you back to extend the conversation. You're calling us to understand that leaders have to be focused and intentional and sophisticated in approaching these four freedoms. I believe is revolutionizing the conversation and calling us to ask questions at such a fundamental level that we need to have more conversation and more guidance from people like you, and so we're just so grateful for you joining us today. And we will be sharing this video with all of our audience. We'll be coming back around to questions about belonging, diversity, inclusion, and building freedom at work through the rest of our speaker series. So thank you everyone for joining.